Yeah. I was talking about wildcatting and starting a corporation that's collapsible. Yes. A lot of investors they're called secured creditors. A person who is owed money and whose claim is secured by a lien of mortgage on the debtor's property. Then there's what's known as securities, stocks, bonds, and other documents showing ownership of a share of a company or evidencing debt owed by it. And then there's Securities and Exchange Commission, a federal regulatory agency that supervises the securities industry. Oh. Quite often when you start one of these collapsible corporations, the first thing you would want to do is attract as much investment as possible. Let's use oil wildcatting for an example. Pooch. You buy yourself one of these oil wildcatting companies. You go out there in the middle of the desert someplace. You say, we're going to strike oil, and if you give me $10 million, I'll give you 10% of the total amount of oil that we're going to get. Yeah. And you do that to those in the fish family, and you get to, I don't know, maybe a couple $100 million, right? Well, you're out there in the middle of the desert with a bunch of wildcatters that are married to women that really don't wear fancy pants. But what so often happens in these types of collapsible corporations is they're not big enough to call attention to themselves, but they're large enough that you can get millions of dollars to invest in other things that you want to invest in as the person that's setting up the collapsible corporation. So you go through and you attract $10 million. The first thing you do is you go out, you buy yourself a new truck or a new car, whatever it is your business is, right? And it's got to be a nice one because people have to believe you, right? Now, you know what happens when you buy or sell a vehicle? You actually have to sign the title. So every corporate vehicle, there has to be a signature of the corporate ownership of the title of the vehicle. Now, let's say you buy a used car, a nice Cadillac, okay, from California. Yes, yes, yes. And it's 3 or 4 years old, but you look well to do. Well to do. There's on the bottom of the titles in Washington State, there's the part that the seller fills out. How are you today? Now, I have this thing about fish family signatures and what's known as forgeries. Now, I wanted to get the actual signature of all the collapsed corporations for the last 40 years of their automobile ownership or the sale of any automobile that the corporation. In fact, you know what? I've owned some vehicles, as difficult as it is to believe that I've actually owned vehicles. But when I sell a vehicle, I have to fill out that bottom portion and return it to the Department of Motor Vehicles within 10 days, or I myself have the liability in the event that the new owner were to get in a wreck. Right. Now, I would think that every driver's licensing or automobile licensing, the license plate, where you get the license plate, yeah, they probably scan all those titles in to some sort of supercomputer. Yep, that's what they do. Now let's say, okay, I got your signatures on most other items, but I don't have your signatures of the transfer of title of the vehicles that you owned. Now, sometimes it's difficult to get the signature of the actual corporation. It could be a real person. And then for those that clone themselves multiple thousands of times, they, of course, would have to have a vehicle for every one of their clones. Now, when you go to sign title as taking ownership of a vehicle, yes, or selling it to somebody, yes, I'm going to need to know all the signatures on the front part of all the vehicle titles. Yep. All the signatures on the seller's part of the title on the bottom of the title, yes. And then if you got any financing from any bank or lending institution, I'm going to need to know the signatures on the back of every title. Now, if I find a forgery, cacao. If I find some sort of scribble from a Fish family member, I'm going to look through all the corporations and who they were owned by. Then I'm going to look at the investors that got screwed out of their money. Puko. You, of course, have to own a vehicle in the corporate name. So give me every title, the actual signature on the front of the titles, the signature on the bottom of the titles when you sell a vehicle, and the signature on the back of the titles, because there's somebody that still has ownership of the vehicle until you pay it off. Then give me the corporate ownership and find out how many ended up in collapsible corporations where fish families invested money, but they just never made enough money to pay income taxes. Then how many ended up in bankruptcy. You'd be surprised how many actual citizens that are real human beings are somewhat conscientious about paying income taxes. You'd be surprised. You really would.